see that schools are a major piece of the total general fund budget. And you see environmental services, which includes transportation, is about 7%. The transportation and development sections of environmental services are approximately 2%. The other one to note is non-departmental, regional, and metro is the largest single piece of that. And that is going to be a theme as we go through all of the material. And then you can see that there are a variety of sources at the bottom of the sheet. The revenue comes from many different places. 55% comes from real estate taxes, but there are many other taxes, fees, and state aid that come into the county. And I would say for transportation, we probably have the most diverse set of revenue sources coming in to support transportation activities. So that's just an overview. The county is well over $1 billion general fund operation. The next page, which looks like that, it's sort of a simplified org chart, just shows all of the things that are in transportation. So we have our long-range transportation planning and Complete Streets Capital Project Management Group. Transit, we operate a number of different transit services. We operate ART, which carries about 2.5 million people a year. We provide the lion's share of paratransit services in Arlington, which is for people with disabilities that can't use fixed route. Fairly expensive program. We do all of the Metrobus and Metro Rail coordination and a whole series of transit capital projects. Most of that was transferred from Metro several years ago. The development services section reviews all site plans, use permits, and by right developments for the county in regard to all the infrastructure, utilities, parking. Our commuter services program, and Melissa will get into that this evening, is probably one of the largest such programs in the country and does a whole array of things. You may see Walk Arlington, Bike Arlington, Car Share, Bike Share, CommuterPage.com, Commuter Connect, I mean, and on and on and on, are all under the umbrella of commuter services. We are also providing services to the District of Columbia, and at one point we were also providing some services to the City of Alexandria. So we've become kind of a clearinghouse for TDM services in the region. Going on, transportation, engineering, and operations, probably one of what one would think of as the more traditional transportation groups. Does everything from signal operations, street lights, pavement markings, intersection design, all regulatory signage, all those operating functions. Parking meters, parking meter collection falls under that. And then there are a whole series of specialty funds. The Transportation Capital Fund, and I'll get into this in the capital program, is the commercial and industrial real estate tax that is specifically allocated for transportation capital. We manage the Ballston Garage, and we also manage the Crystal City, Potomac Yard, Pentagon City tax increment financing area fund that was approved as part of the as part of the Crystal City sector plan. Overall, and you're welcome to go into the details of what Sarah posted on the website. There are probably 20-some pages of detail about what all these groups are doing and the various revenues and expenses. The official county board adopted a fiscal 13 budget for transportation. We had expenses of roughly $32 million, revenues of about $23.5 million, with a net tax support of $9.5 million. So net tax support was about 28.8%, which is actually probably the lowest in the county. And it's because of so many different revenue sources coming in. In terms of the revised budget, it actually is higher than that, more revenue, and the actual net tax support for this year is really about 24-point-something%. And so that's just an overview. Relatively low net tax support for a very large operation. operation. We have substantial federal and state funding in our program. Our development services section is mostly self-supporting with the exception of the county projects, which we do not charge fees. But there's been a trend year in, year out of lower and lower net tax support while we're expected to deliver more services. I think when I started we were probably closer to 50% net tax support. So we've dropped a lot. Any questions about the operating budget? Realize kept this very high level. Yes.
Of the general fund revenues in the real estate, 55%, what percentage of that is commercial versus residential?
It is 49% commercial, which also includes multifamily residential on the rental side only. So it's 51% residential ownership. And it's deviated year in and year out. I mean, it's years when commercial is down, residential, I mean, they kind of seesaw back and forth, but never by more than a couple percentage points. Arlington has one of the most balanced real estate portfolios in the country.
Other jurisdictions tend to go in which direction of tax?
Heavily, in terms of the base, most jurisdictions are heavily residential. Generally 70%, 75%.
Are those jurisdictions with subway service or just jurisdictions nationwide?
Yes. No, in this region, I think we could ask for the information from Fairfax County and Montgomery County and PG County, but all of them have much lower commercial shares of the total portfolio.
Even the district?
I don't have the district information.
There's a skew by the large federal donors.
I see.
Alexandria might be more obvious call.
I think actually I saw something from Arlington real estate.
Terry Holtzheimer actually gave a presentation this morning and had a graphic showing all of that. I was just trying to pull it up and seeing if it's posted already. So.
They may be helpful.
Yeah. Well, I wonder about, if we're comparing to other jurisdictions, we're in the diamond, right? So it would be helpful to have other. Let me ask you the question another way. My understanding is that from a previous presentation that Arlington has more jobs than residents.
Yes.
For what other regional jurisdictions is that also true?
Only Arlington and the district.
So I would say that if we were making these kinds of tax-based comparisons, it would be helpful to have the district for comparison as well.
Although one thing I will mention is that for transportation purposes, the district is a state and not a locality. So they are responsible for the interstate system and the interstate bridges, and they receive federal aid directly from Federal Highway Administration. So I think for transportation funding, there are a lot of nuances.
It also might be worthwhile the comparison, perhaps, to other cities in the country, or jurisdictions, I should say, municipalities in the country, that might have similar characteristics. I wonder if there are suburbs, for example, of New York, or
San Francisco.
Actually, I use the S word, right? Are we a suburb? We don't know. We're a suburb. Are we the city, or are we a suburb? All right, we don't agree about that. But there might be comparable hybrid jurisdictions in other regions that might serve as, comparisons from a funding perspective.
But this was simply a factual information of what's in the budget and how do we pay for operations and how do we pay for capital.
You mentioned that the number had come down in terms of how much of transportation is provided by property tax, real estate taxes, maybe by half in a percentage basis, from 50 to 25 in the last 2 years. What's presumably the overall budget for transportation hasn't gone down, so what are the sources that have gone so high?
Our commuter services program has been very aggressive in commissions. We are the largest purveyor of MARC and BRE tickets in the region. We actually process most of them. We get the lion's share of all the TDM grants in the state. We probably get in excess of 50% of all available state grants. We've been increasingly aggressive with getting state aid back for transit, for art, for STAR. Parking meter collections have doubled in the last 8 years. We've gone from 3.5 to 8 million. Art revenue, bus revenue has gone from 450,000 to 2.4 million. I mean, so those are some of the major swings in fee revenue. And for example, the commuter services program has been flatlined at about $300,000 to $340,000 of net tax support for the last probably 5 or 6 years. Planning program has been flatlined. More of the planning staff have been converted to capital projects, working on capital project management. Some of the transit staff has been capitalized to build transit projects like the metro station in Roslyn. So it's an overall trend of moving off general fund and moving more into capital construction and fee services and grant support.
Dennis, is much of your operation a fee-for-service base, like the development fund and CCG?
It's not that.
So it's not that directly?
It's not that direct. Development services recovers most of its cost for processing site plan use permits and by rights, but there's an increment that isn't covered because we process county facilities and schools and county, other county projects. But it's very close to capture. But there is a lot of, Arlington pays in more than it gets back in terms of state, various types of state taxes and fees. And the one place we almost get back what we pay in is in transportation. So we do get back state aid for transit, some state aid for roads, for road maintenance, signal maintenance.
Dennis, I'm not sure what comprises your presentation today.
Well, I have a second part, which is the capital program, which would probably be of more interest to this group.
Okay.
But the second piece of the operating presentation, so think DOT, relatively small footprint. Large program, diverse program, doing lots of services, but a relatively small net tax support footprint. Metro is different. And I'm hoping, did we pass out the Metro sheets? It looks like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So Metro is coming straight out of general fund. We do receive, it's a big program, we support the ongoing operation of Metro Bus, Metro Rail, and Metro Access, and that includes the operation and maintenance of the core system. So this is our part of the regional pot that funds Metro. If you go to the financial summary, this is exclusive of any fare revenue. Fare revenue covers about 80-some% of the Metro Rail operation, about 30% of bus, and probably only a few percent of Metro Access. So this is net. So in the adopted fiscal 13 budget, the net subsidy from Arlington was basically $41.9 million net. Now we do get.
Can I just ask a question about, you had an 80-some-odd, 30-some-odd figure that you just talked about for how much fare is covered?
Yes.
Is that operating or operating plus capital?
Just operating.
Okay, so capital.
Is actually in another part of this presentation.
Got it.
This is just operating support to just run the system. There are different formulas for different services. The rail formula is different from the bus, is different from the paratransit formula. But you can see our share of the regional subsidy was 41.9. It's going to be closer to 50 million this year. And then we get various sources of aid to help bring that number down. So state transit aid, this is some of that money from the state coming back. That's 12.4 million. There is a regional gas tax in Northern Virginia. That produced about 3 million in 13. So the subtotal of those revenues was 15.4. And then there were a couple other smaller revenue sources that amounted to 16.4 million. So our net tax support, after those outside sources, was close to 25.5 million. This is general fund. This is our single biggest expenditure in transportation by far.
How are fare rates determined for Metro Bus?
They are determined by the Metro Board, which has representation from the district, Maryland, Northern Virginia jurisdictions, the state. We are represented with an alternate seat, not a permanent seat or a full-blown seat. Our seat was taken.
Part of their charter is it to run a cash flow net zero business? Is it how do they determine those rates and just the general where the money comes from?
There's been a long-standing WMATA compact, which is WMATA is us in a way. It's the member jurisdictions and the states. It's run to provide regional mobility, and each year, in this case, Metro is moved to an every other year cycle. They look at a balancing of fares and regional subsidies. And there's a lot of interaction between the jurisdictions to determine what's the right mix. But Metro does not have any standalone outside source other than its real estate portfolios, some advertising revenue. But the two primary sources of revenue for Metro on the operating side are fares and subsidies, jurisdictional subsidies.
Dennis, which cities in the world have subway systems without government subsidies?
Probably very few. Almost all urban transportation systems are subsidized to some extent.
Do you know if there have been studies that have been done about the elasticity of demand for
Metro actually does that as part of their assessment of fares. They look at, the fare goes up by this much, this is going to be the natural ridership loss. And sometimes it can be negative, which is you drive more people away from the system and you lose more revenue.
Or you could make more revenue.
You could. Depends on everything else. But it also depends on the regional values.
Yes.
I think the region shares a value in moving more people without more congestion. And Metro is a big part of that. It certainly isn't Roslyn, where we move like 36,000 people a day on and off the rail system just at that one station.
There's also a value of public investment in commerce. All of our investment in transportation, all of our public investment, whether it be roads, sidewalks, airports, subways, it's public investment in facilitating commerce and everything else that the populace does.
Yes.
Quality of life.
But I think the important point here is that Arlington has made a very long-standing commitment to Metro. It has served the county incredibly well, but it's expensive. It requires ongoing, really substantial operating support. And with the Silver Line coming on at the end of the year, we are being asked to give more because we are being assessed with part of that cost. And that's hitting it's hitting this budget cycle. Anything else on the operating side? Maybe I can go to capital. Again, this is, I actually did make copies of this because it wasn't nearly as daunting as the full operating budget. The county goes through a capital improvement program update process every other year, so it's a biennial process. We concluded that process in the summer of 2012. So these documents are on the county website. If you look for the approved 10-year CIP, you will find far more detail than I'm giving you in terms of the transportation program. I've included two pieces of this for your consideration that really comprise the transportation portions of the CIP. One is under the banner of just transportation programs, and that is a $981 million program over a 10-year period. But I've also added in the other part of our program, which is Metro. The total combined program is roughly $1.2 billion. It's almost half of the county's entire CIP, excluding schools. If you flip to the second page, so there's a lot of discussion in terms of the program summary. I'm not going to go into that, but I am going to just walk you through the uses and sources of the program over 10 years. Transit is a huge part of our program. So over half of all of the spending is on transit capacity, adding rail and bus capacity to the county. The next biggest category is called the Complete Streets Program. This is primarily rebuilding the arterial streets in the commercial districts, with some reconstruction outside of those, but primarily in the commercial districts. A smaller category called Local Initiatives. That is Walk Arlington, Bike Arlington, and some of the smaller programs. And then Maintenance Capital is predominantly paving. It also includes bridge rehabilitation. So that's how our program's broken out, $981 million over 10 years. An incredibly diverse set of funding sources. So you see the state and federal funding line item is $191 million. We currently have $52 million of federal transit aid, direct grants that we're working on. There is a lot of federal and state aid in our program. The Transportation Capital Fund is the next largest source of transportation funding in our program. This is the commercial and industrial real estate tax. This was a county board adopted tax in 2009. It is 12.5 cents on top of the real estate rate for all office properties, retail properties, hotels, or any increment in buildings that have those uses. It's not only the capital fund, but if you also go down to other bonds, the other bonds are principally bonds off of that source. You can also see tax increment financing. This is a special taxing district that was set up in Pentagon City, Crystal City, and Potomac Yard to help revitalize Crystal City. The tax increment financing line item is the sort of what we call the pay-go portion of that source, but some of that also ends up showing up in the other bonds section. Pay-go is money that comes from various funding sources each year that's set aside predominantly for maintenance capital or things of a shorter life expectancy. And then GEO bond is our most traditional capital bonding source, and that's really off the real estate tax base. Most of the money that is in previously approved funding is federal and state aid and commercial real estate tax. Those are balances that are being carried that support projects like the Roslyn second entrance, which has a cash flow burn rate of about $1.5 million a month. So you need to have cash balances. So an incredibly diverse set of sources. If you flip to the next page, the Metro funding, which is reported on discretely, we basically are committing somewhere between 18 and 21 million a year to Metro Capital. This is state of good repair, and that's supported by two sources. It's supported by some state aid, but it's principally coming from new bond referenda from GeoBond. And that's a commitment every year. And it will continue, it will go up with the silver line. I should mention all of the Metro Capital doesn't buy things like Metro station entrances. That's off budget. So any enhancements like the Roslyn second entrance project, the Pentagon City elevator project, Ballston West entrance, are all funded out of the local transportation program. So the $20 million that we spend with Metro every year doesn't buy anything. You have to actually come up with more money to do those other things under our current arrangement. This is one of the challenges of having a large regional rail and bus agency that has no dedicated funding. I describe it as the cost plus model. It costs a lot, and whatever else you might want costs more.
So, I mean, Dennis, it seems that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, we're just kind of meeting those kind of continual maintenance obligations and nothing much more than that.
Well, I would.
Is that kind of what it seems like?
Well, I think the way the program is structured is that the general tax base supports the ongoing operation and maintenance of the system.
Right.
Roads, signals, bridges, and Metro.
Maybe more in terms of Metro, that the county contribution, Metro as a whole is pretty much kind of treading water to make sure that we're meeting our obligations.
Yes.
But we're not really necessarily, you know,
They
other than Silver Line.
Yeah, they
expansion,
are
distributing.
They are basically rebuilding the system in place. That's why we have all the service disruptions. We have a rail system that in some cases is over 30 years old, and they have to basically rebuild all the track and the switches.
And the escalators.
But it doesn't, the current Metro program doesn't buy a lot of additional capacity. It doesn't get us to all 8-car trains, which is something we really need.
Do you have a sense of how many 6-car trains are there in terms of all the trains?
We're about 1/3 8-car trains, 2/3 6.
Okay.
But what's happened is Metro basically got out of the local projects business, and about 3 to 4 years ago that was transferred over to localities. Rosalind Metro second entrance started as a WMATA project and was transferred to us. We're building it, and we're going to be turning it back to them after it's completed.
Do you have a sense of the return on investment on moving to 8-car trains versus 6? I mean, I know there's a capital expense there, but is there a sense that, you know, more people potentially could do it if they got to spread out more and potentially had a better ride?
I think our own board's focus is expanding the rail system, adding capacity, adding all 8-car trains is necessary for regional mobility. But we have to get all the other regional players to agree and to step in and to help fund it.
Understand.
Dennis, I have more questions on that point, but I don't want to stop you before you finish your presentation. So would it be better to let you continue, or do you want to have another question on this topic?
I'm not going to say much more.
You say any more?
So I am going to say that the way our program is currently structured, and this affects Metro, is that the commercial and industrial real estate tax and the tax increment financing district in the Jeff Davis corridor have enabled us to add capacity and rebuild major arterial streets in a way that GEO bonds have not. What it means, because we've shifted, is that the predominant investments in the county are being made in Roswell and Ballston and Jeff Davis corridor, and to a lesser extent Columbia Pike, because it's where the money's being raised and it's where the development revenue is coming from. So the money trail actually has a dramatic influence on the program. It's also where our system is most stretched, where we actually need to rebuild arterial streets and we need to add additional rail station capacity. But I can't emphasize, without the commercial and industrial real estate tax, our program would be much, much smaller. And we would not be making rail investments.
And we are at the maximum enabled by state.
That's
authority.
correct. And there is another dynamic that is playing out as I'm here tonight. We have on a state transportation bill that's been adopted by both houses that adds significant new revenue both at the state level and the regional level. We are still evaluating what that means for Arlington.
So, as I understand it, one of the things James just said and you said together, James was sort of implying that we're, we have a bunch of different streams and a bunch of different activities, and it's all at its limit. We push the balloon here, it goes out here, kind of thing. And what you're saying is that, in fact, where we're pumping in air into the balloon is Crystal City and Roslyn, and that's also where we're getting more output. And am I correctly understanding that, in fact, you're jiving on that point, the two of you?
That if you look at our program sources, and if you look at the county board adopted CIP program, it calls for major investments in the mixed use districts. And that's where the money's being spent.
To be fair, that's where the money's actually coming into the general fund.
That's correct.
Not necessarily to the transportation sliver, but the majority of the revenue you're getting from, commercial taxes is coming from Crystal City and from Roslyn and from Ballston, where there are the big buildings.
Is that what you meant, Dennis?
Let me go back. In terms of the transportation program, the commercial industrial real estate tax is the largest source of locally generated revenue for the program if you don't include Metro.
So I had a couple of other sort of clarifying questions that I think I know the answer to, or that I know part of the answer to. But you talked about 8-car trains. My understanding is that for many years now, at the rush hour peak, the number of trains going through the Roslyn Tunnel has reached its maximum.
That's been true for some time.
That for at least a decade or so, we haven't been able to add another trip through the Roslyn Tunnel. And right now that's shared by blue and orange, and later it will be shared by orange and silver.
And blue.
And blue. So every new silver means subtracting an orange or a blue.
Yes.
Mostly blue, isn't it?
Both. And I do want to stay on point. I mean, we do need to circle back that this is a commercial parking lot.
I'm talking about pushing the balloon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a limit, right? So and just to nail that home, there was in the 2020 Metro Plan, and there was, I think, a resurgence of investigation of this in the last 6 months, a very notional, dreamlike plan of adding another river crossing where Key Bridge is for Metro, right?
Yes.
It's an unplanned.
It's called Metro Forward. It's their strategic plan.
Yeah. So we talked about Metro's 10-year capital budget just to maintain, to keep the trains from breaking down, is $10 billion. Is there any sense of the very roughest order of magnitude to do something like add blue line service across the Potomac at Key Bridge, or order of magnitude maybe of how much something like that would cost?
I don't have that at this time.
I'd say 10 billion would be a good guess.
More than $1 billion?
More than $1 billion would be an excellent.
You said 10 billion, right?
Well, you said order of magnitude, so yeah,
Yes,
that's how many
it's
zeros.
the large-scale metro long-term recommendations are in the billions of dollars.
And once we get to, and we can't go past 8-car trains without incurring similarly gigantic capital costs to increase the size of stations, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so we're at 6-car trains now, at the limit of the Roslyn Tunnel. We can go up to 8-car trains, which is possibly a 30% increase or so. And that's including all the regional loads. That's including all the people coming from Fairfax and DC who aren't even stopping in Arlington. And then that's it. We're done with the Roslyn-Ballston Tunnel in terms of its capacity to carry people. Is that right?
Yes. But I will mention that the capacity isn't used up in both directions at all times.
Only at the peak.
Only at the peak in the peak direction. So to the extent that you actually fill trains in both directions, that's a really good thing.
It sure is.
You know, if we fill Silver Line trains going outbound, that's a great thing for the system.
Right, but if DC and Fairfax fill them in both directions before we can even get on or off, that's a problem.
I think that's the other question. I mean, we talked a little bit last time about people, this may be not a question you have the answer to, Dennis, but we have numbers on the projections for people who are single occupancy vehicle trips to Tyson's and things now from that originate in Arlington. Do we have the reverse of that, single occupancy trips from Tyson's into Arlington that are now going to be? Do we have a sense, I guess, of how fully trains are going to be coming into Arlington?
I don't have that information with me tonight. And we haven't done detailed O&D studies of the Silver Line. I will say there are many, many Arlington residents that are commuting out to Tyson's and to Reston, and it jams up Glebe Road and the Fairfax Drive on-ramps every morning. And so they're natural candidates to try to entice onto rail. And that's, I mean, Fairfax County is counting on that.
I used to live with two girls who lived in the same place and went to the same place each morning, and they both drove different cars. Baffled, but they would be kidding.
I'm struck by the Transportation Capital Fund, and I think that was part of your point, was to strike us with the importance of that fund. Let me make sure I understand it. So there's a 12.5-cent valuation tax?
Well, it's an add-on to the real estate tax. So they pay the base real estate tax, the stormwater tax, and then 12.5 cents on that.
So that's an annual fee or an annual tax on top of the assessed value of commercial and industrial real estate?
That's correct.
And is all of that dedicated to the Transportation Capital Fund, or does it go to other sources?
No, it's 100% dedicated to Transportation Capital.
And I know it's never worth paying too much attention to the out years in a 10-year budget, but why is it so much lower starting in,
It's because we start actually bonding off the source. And so what you're seeing in that line item is the PAYGO, what we call PAYGO. PAYGO means you're spending in year of that it's coming in, that you're not actually issuing debt off it. So that's showing a split when we start actually issuing debt off that source. The same is true with the TIF district.
So essentially the reason why, just to draw specific numbers, the Transportation Capital Fund goes from 22.7 million in FY17 to about half that, 11.9 million in FY18 is because which line goes up?
It is the other bonds. You actually see this is showing, and we're probably going to delay until possibly as late as 15, but it shows that in 14 that we issued $21 million in revenue bonds. And then in 15 we issued additional increments of revenue bonds.
So we're essentially bonding forward the out years of the Transportation Capital. Okay, thank you.
So there's a couple of major points I think that come out of this. One is this is an extraordinarily expensive undertaking to fund regional transportation system in Arlington. The geographically small has a fairly significant piece and has for many, many years. Arlington built Metro when it was relatively cheap.
It's no longer cheap.
It's no longer cheap, but there's a burden, a financial burden that's on all of us. And sometimes the numbers are plugins that don't come until the budget is already partly down the path, but they have to pay the number, they have to pay the bill, regardless. And I believe the silver line number is still somewhat fuzzy.
We're continuing to negotiate to try to get that number down, but it was a really big number for 14.
Part of the significance of the number, though, I think, is it points out the regional context in which we're functioning at the transportation system level, but also in which this methodology that we're about has got to also work. You know, neighborhood context built up to a regional transportation system. And it's pretty clear there's a lot of folks contributing to this fund, not just commercial real estate, but every taxpayer is a part of it. Is there anything else you wanted to add on?
The only other thing is and maybe I could give an update to the group at a later time, but the state transportation bill is extremely complicated, draws on many different sources, and affects us in ways that we still haven't thoroughly evaluated. But it has a state implication, and it flows through the formulas down to localities, and then there is a very sizable Northern Virginia element, and so we're still crunching through that. I mean, it was just passed on Saturday, so has been a lot of time. But that actually could change our program.
The governor hasn't signed it yet.
It will likely be signed in some form in the next couple of weeks, and we're trying to influence the details of that.
So as we move forward, we've sort of put a lot of information on the table, and you know, there's both breadth and some depth to the information. You know, I think we've always been tempted to sort of drill down in whatever topic we're in and try to get to some fine detail. But what we really have to do now is think about this whole program very broadly, and understand what is the range of knowledge and information that we need, that we have and need in order to create a credible methodology. And is it available? And if it's not available to us, what can we do, you know, with the information that is available? There's really just limits to what.
When you say methodology, what are you talking about?
We're going to get into that in a second. So just hang on to that. But the charge of the group is to create a methodology for determining appropriate parking for commercial office buildings, right? So, and what the methodology might look like is open to this group's sort of figuring out what makes sense, right? So what do we need to, and that's part of sort of digesting all this information is what do we need to know, and what do we need to factor, and what do we need to balance in order to come up with what's appropriate for any project, right? So what we want to do now is this is really the moment where we're shifting from learning to figuring out how do we apply some of this knowledge and some of this learning. So I've actually asked Dennis if he could just sort of give us a quick and dirty reminder.
We're going to do a few more of these, though.
Oh,
before
that's
this.
right. I'm sorry. We have Melissa giving us the TDM.
And we're going to do this. And then
Yeah. Right.
Okay, great.
Should we
I've
pass
got
them?
handouts.
Yeah.
She has nice handouts.
So this was about a lot of people were asking about what is the different TDM options that there are and what is the program in the county. And so, Melissa, you might explain what you do, what your job is.
And actually, as she's, why don't I just introduce the topics as she's, yep. Arlington passed a policy, basically it's called the Transportation Demand Management Matrix back in 1991, which established the idea that development, site plan use permit development should have some kind of transportation demand management program associated with those projects. So the policy was first put in place in '91. It was reaffirmed in the MTP in 2009. I would say from a staff perspective, limited implementation through the 90s, limited implementation even into the early 2000s. The program really started to become more rigorous with site plan conditions being monitored with follow-up actions by staff really in the 2004-2005 timeframe. So the point to be taken, the policy was adopted in '91, but in terms of the real push in terms of providing a very broad and array of services and a very deep set of program support, that really came about really in the last 6 to 8 years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa, who I'm thrilled is part of our TDM staff.
Hi, I'm going to stand up because I can't see everybody. So I wanted, this packet, I was sort of charged with providing a more intimate glimpse into what ACCS offers to the community as a whole. You sort of seen and I think heard through your previous discussions, which I wasn't a part, that it is a part of the site plan process. And so the first couple papers are perhaps less glossy and fancy, but they describe how transportation demand management and the Arlington County Commuter Services Bureau as a whole works with a site plan to make, basically to incentivize change travel behavior. When it comes to a site plan, there are two different pieces. There's the text, which I think, have people seen this before? I know
No.
this is on the internet. And the text of a site plan condition, which developers may have seen before, and the TDM condition there's a standard-based set of requirements, and all site plans basically get this language approved in the site plan, and that language guides how TDM is implemented at that building. The accompanying spreadsheet is really just an illustration of what that looks like in dollar signs for some discrete components of the TDM program. So I can give some examples of how these correspond. There are numbers that the numbers with the spreadsheet are associated with the words. I don't really want to walk through every single piece of it, but some examples are ATP membership. There really isn't a dollar figure to that because Arlington Transportation Partners, that's this packet here, provides their services essentially for free to a developer. For free, Arlington pays for it. Another key component of a transportation demand management program at a site plan is the property transportation coordinator role. So that's described in words here. It's an ongoing role. It's an expectation by the county that there's someone on that site who's going to carry transportation demand management through the life of the site. That tends to be a property manager, sometimes a concierge. There are also annual contributions, which are paid by the owner of the property over time, and so the base TDM expectation is 30 years of annual payments, and they're calculated on a square footage ratio. There are also infrastructure pieces. Information kiosk is written here as a line item. Other infrastructure have been separated out of the TDM condition for sort of efficiency, but that would be like, for instance, bike parking. And there are ongoing programs that have costs associated with them. That could be the carpool and vanpool programs that are expected to be run at a commercial property. It also includes the distribution of smart trip cards to new employees on site or new employees of the property management company. So that's sort of how that's how this is laid out, and that's what the site plan condition would describe. So it's something that the developer knows up front when they're building the property. That's a part of how the property is going to run in the future. What gets more interesting is that none of this really happens without ongoing coordination and effort by Arlington County Commuter Services, by Arlington